Today, we're having dinner in Byzantium. Bon appétit! Welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends in medieval studies. I'm Lucie Laumonier, a medieval historian and the podcast host, and today I'm talking with Adam Morin, a PhD candidate in history at Queen's University here in Canada. Hello, Adam. Thank you very much for being here.
Well, hello, Lucy. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Adam, you study the Byzantine food culture, meaning food in their culinary and cultural context in the Byzantine Empire. Would you give us the gist of your research project and tell us what brought you to that particular field of research?
Sure. So I study the food culture of the Byzantine Empire. So what that means, in essence, is that I study the foods that people ate in Byzantium, as well as the culture that surrounds food. So when discussing culture, some of the things that I look at, for example, are what are some of the cultural associations that people have with food? What do people think of when they eat a peach, for example? Is it just a sweet, refreshing fruit, or is there something more to it? I also look at flavor profiles that Byzantines may find tasty or repulsive, as the case may be. I also study dining culture, for example. So, what do Byzantines consider to be a meal? What do Byzantines consider an ideal meal? When are meal times? What are meal times called? Etiquette, things of that nature. So, in short, basically, I study Byzantine food and how people felt about the food that they ate in Byzantium.
And how did you end up doing food culture? Because I think that your MA was absolutely not in that area. I think you were studying
That's right.
emperor, something like that.
Yeah, I approach Byzantine food culture from the Byzantine end. So I've been fascinated with the Byzantine Empire for years and years, as long as I can imagine. So when I started university, I had a pretty clear idea that that's the direction I wanted to go in. Originally, my research focused more on Byzantine politics, but for my PhD research, I found that political research has been fairly comprehensively done already in Byzantine studies, and also I've always been interested in the reality on the ground, so to speak, of Byzantium.
Yeah.
What is Byzantine regular life, so to speak? What is how does the average person feel, think, act, live in Byzantium? And so, when considering these questions, the issue of food really came up. And it's kind of funny because the way the idea itself to do this project came to me was I was trying to think of an ideal suitable project to work on for my PhD, and I just happened to be going to the grocery store at the time, and I had this idea. Well, I wonder what a Byzantine grocery list would look like. And that one thought really set me on this journey of discovering Byzantine food culture, and it's been a wonderful, rewarding journey so far.
It's wonderful, and I really understand what you're talking about because I'm a social historian and I'm interested in the kind of the real people.
The people whose faces were never on a gold coin.
Yes, exactly. A question I have, I think it's interesting also maybe for a start, is to maybe talk about the historical documents and sources that are available for you to study foods and food culture. Are you looking maybe at narrative texts, chronicles? Are there collections of recipes? Do you use also information coming from archaeology, maybe, animal bones or archaeobotany, that kind of more scientific information?
Yeah, for sure. So the main thrust of my research is textual. So essentially, one of the things I'm doing is reading through as much of the Byzantine corpus as possible, and making note of every occasion where I find something that refers to a specific food item, or to how people felt about food, or having to do with dining, things of this nature. Basically, that part of it is a giant Easter egg hunt. I also another key aspect of the research is TLG, and that stands for Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. And TLG is a unbelievable online resource of digitized ancient and medieval Greek texts, and it contains over 10,000 works associated with 4,000 authors, more than 110 million words that are fully text searchable. So those two combined have been incredibly helpful and effective in trying to get to the bottom of Byzantine food culture. Now, you mentioned collections of recipes. Unfortunately, we have no surviving cookbooks from Byzantium. Unfortunately, as with many vanished empires, the amount of documentation we have remaining for Byzantium is just a tiny, tiny fraction of what was actually out there.
Okay, so let's go back to the Byzantine grocery list. And let's talk about food also as a social marker, because even today, food is not like people from, let's say, the working class are not eating the same food than the elite. We can just think today as a caviar or champagne as something associated with wealth and the social elite. So I'd like you, if possible, to walk us through the different social milieu of Byzantium and talk maybe a little bit about their food and I mean, if relevant, maybe the etiquette or the dining culture. Maybe we could start from the bottom and with, I mean, the peasantry. So, what kind of food did they eat, and what kind of food was also associated with the peasantry?
For sure. In Byzantium, as with any other place, the food that you ate was restricted by what you could buy.
Yeah.
And to that end, the real differences in dining between peasant and elite food basically comes down to what can you afford, essentially. So for peasants, the staple of any peasant diet and any Byzantine diet for that matter is going to be bread. Byzantium is a place that doesn't have high calorie starches like potatoes. It did have some rice, but rice was a very exotic grain at this time. It would have been extremely expensive. So the basis of the diet would have been bread and typically things like vegetables, cheese, occasionally meat in the form of fish. But by and large, peasants tended to eat a primarily vegetarian diet, consisting mostly of bread, fresh vegetables, and cheese.
So let's move on maybe to more middling milieu, maybe shop owners, artisans of the middling class in more maybe cities. What would they have access to?
Well, if you're talking about the city, Constantinople, they would have had access to a unbelievable array of foods, both fresh and preserved, local and imported. Typically speaking, diets of people in the cities as well as in the surrounding countryside sort of followed what Fernand Braudel called the essential trinity of Mediterranean food, which is olive oil, wine, and wheat. Typically, the Byzantine idea of what a meal should consist of is usually bread plus something called prosfagion. You can call it a relish or an accompaniment. But typically, this prosfagion was ideally, it would be meat, but usually it would be cheese, or if that wasn't available, they would tend to use just whatever greens or vegetables they had around. But the idea of a good meal was always bread plus your accompaniment, which was called prosfagion. So the question is, what is that prosfagion going to be? So if you're in the city, you could buy a whole array of seafood. Bread shops were absolutely everywhere, scattered throughout the city. You'd have access to a lot of fresh vegetables. Also you'd have things like pickled vegetables. The Byzantine term for a grocer is actually sadamarioi, which means seller of pickled vegetables. So things like pickled and preserved vegetables would have been a key part of the diet as well. Um, it would have been quite a balanced diet by modern standards, for sure. But typically, you're looking at bread, wheat bread, olive oil, wine, cheese, a whole assortment of vegetables, pulses, legumes, lupins. So they're certainly not starved for choice in Constantinople. That's not by any means.
And what special and extraordinary food did the elite eat?
Well, now we're talking about fully roast lamb, covered in its own sauces, gigantic fish swimming in garum, which was a kind of Roman fish sauce, which we'll get into later. Uh, chilled fruit was another food that was the reserve of the elite. Uh, the elites, particularly in the palace, imperial palace, would keep fruit in underground vaults where it was cooler, and then during dinners, it would be pulled up on these uh, golden plates essentially and
Mm.
placed in front of the emperor to eat. And the idea of having chilled fruit was very luxurious and sort of a marker of the elite by all means. But one other food that seems to come up in sources as being of a particular value to the elite was something called Vlach cheese. Now, the Vlach were a group of nomadic herders who lived in modern day Bulgaria in the mountains. And every fall, they would come down and sell their Vlach cheese, which seems to have been a, a firm aged sheep's milk cheese, possibly something like Pecorino Romano or a Manchego. And this cheese is absolutely extolled for its virtue. In a number of sources. We actually have one letter written by Michael Italicos to a certain Prodromos. Michael Italicos was a Byzantine courtier in the 11th century, sorry, 12th century, and the whole letter is a whole debate asking his friend why he prefers bacon to cheese. Why do you like bacon? Cheese is so much better. Bacon is from pigs. It's very earthy. Cheese is, from milk, which surrounds the heavens in the Milky Way. But one of the things he singles out is the particular value of Vlach cheese in this. So Vlach cheese seems to have been sort of a very much a an item of conspicuous consumption among the Byzantine elite, no question.
What about spices in the Byzantine food culture?
Yeah, spices, as in Western Europe, were available but expensive. Byzantium certainly had access to some spices that Western Europe did not. For example, nutmeg was a little bit more common in Byzantium than in elsewhere. They also had access to mastic, which is it's the resin of a tree, but it's only found in the island of Chios in modern day Greece in the Aegean. And that was a very commonly used spice or seasoning that would have been quite rare elsewhere. But apart from that, they had access to a whole range of local and imported spices. So you have pretty much anything you would find in a modern spice cabinet. So you'd have marjoram, coriander, obviously your salt and pepper, cumin, just a whole array of spices. Now, granted, when you're talking about imported spices, these sorts of things are only the reserve of the elite.
Yeah.
So nutmeg, for example, would have been wildly expensive, but you do see it occasionally in as a seasoning for certain elite meals. But yeah, certainly the spices they had available would have been quite wide, but they wouldn't have been available to everybody.
All right. So now that we know what we are going to eat in our fictional Byzantine dinner, tell us about the how to behave when eating and when to eat, and a little bit about the culture of being at the table and eating together.
Right. So, in Byzantine sources, we actually have a fair amount of information on how dining works in different contexts. So, for example, monastic dining in the numerous Orthodox monasteries that dotted the Byzantine Empire, uh, we have quite a bit of information from the monastic charters, which they call typica, which tend to set out in quite extensive detail uh, when to eat, how to eat, how you're supposed to eat, things of that nature. Now, granted, this is it's in a specifically monastic context, but it does shed some interesting light on how they approach dining. So, for example, from the Typicon of the convent of Constantine Leaps in Constantinople, they mention how when you're dining, there has to be no emphasis on precedence. So you have to seat where you're assigned and nowhere else. Dining has to take place in complete silence. There's one interesting note there as well, where they say that if there are multiple dishes laid out on the table, you're not allowed to pick and choose from the dishes that you like. So, so say one bowl is full of soup that you really like, you're not allowed to just pick from that one. You have to take equally from every dish, so that you're not falling victim to the lust of gluttony, so to speak.
Right,
Right?
yeah.
You eat only the food that's in front of you, only what's been provided, and that in silence. Now, of course, that model doesn't so much apply to overall Byzantine society. Now, as regards table manners in general society, this is something that I'm still doing some research on. We have, like I said, we have really good information for things like imperial dining, monastic dining, but I'm still sort of working on what exactly constitute good dining practice for the average citizen. We do have a few mentions of of people acting incredibly boorishly during meals. So, for example, one of the courtiers of Michael III, who was an emperor in the ninth century, um, apparently had an act where he blew out a candle with a fart essentially at the table, and
Okay.
and everyone starts laughing, right? So clearly farting at the table was considered a little bit, uh, inappropriate. So we have some mentions of wildly inappropriate actions at the table, but you did mention real quickly meal times. I can get into that a little bit. Byzantines typically had two main meal times, and they were called Deipnon and Ariston. Deipnon was the evening meal, so it was typically eaten around sunset or shortly thereafter, and that was sort of your one hot meal of the day. So if you're going to have a monokithron, if you're going to have anything that's freshly made, baked, hot essentially, that's the time you're going to eat that. Um, the previous meal called Ariston it sometimes it's translated as breakfast, sometimes it's translated as lunch. It essentially refers to any meal that was eaten before the Deipnon. And Ariston tended to be a very impromptu sort of thing. So it was typically eaten with food that you had on hand. So it could be eaten with some paximati, which was a type of a dried bread very common in Byzantium. Uh, uh, so a lunch of paximati with some cheese and greens would be a very common thing. Normally, it wouldn't be a hot lunch. It would be something eaten more or less on the go. You might buy it from street vendors as well. Um, we also have a hint of a, a particular breakfast meal called a takrama from the Book of Ceremonies. And takrama is interesting because it means a selection, what we might call sort of like a sampler. But used on the context of in the context of breakfast, it's interesting when you consider that next to what modern Turkish breakfast is, for example, which is a whole array of small little dishes, right? So it takrama could refer to that, but it's an interesting sort of a parallel that certainly requires more investigation.
So earlier, Adam, you mentioned that the kind of Bulgarian cheese was seen as having several virtues, and we know that in the Middle Ages, whether in Europe or in Byzantium, food was also associated with health, and there were also a lot of other representations and connotations, maybe more cultural. And you sent me an excerpt of your dissertation in which you discuss peaches and eroticism. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. As I said, one of the things that I look at is examining how individual food items were received in a cultural context in Byzantium. So, for example, peaches, in addition to being a sweet, delicious, juicy fruit, you also get a lot of references to eroticism in Byzantium that surrounds peaches. So, for example, a peach can be used as a way to signal love to a prospective suitor. We have evidence of that from Nikitas Koniada's history from the 12th century. We also have another a rhetorical training exercise which describes a peach as compares it to a rosy-cheeked virgin, things like that. So it's interesting that the peach has this connotation, especially considering the recent emergence of the peach emoji nowadays, for how that refers to. Now, obviously, I don't think there's any connection between the Byzantine conception of a peach and how we use a peach emoji, but I think there might be something suggestive about the way a peach is shaped or something.
Yeah.
But it's a good example of sort of the more cultural dimension of foods that I look into.
All right. I also would like to hear you about flavors. What was seen as tasty or what was repulsive in the Byzantine Empire? And I'm sure it's kind of a difficult challenge to tackle just, writing or reading about flavors and, the adjectives. It's always best, I think, sometimes to just taste things.
Yeah.
So, how do you study flavor in a historical perspective, and what was good and what was bad?
Well, there's a few ways that we can approach that question. One of the ways is I just simply pay attention when somebody writes that they like a particular type of food. The question of how do you divide personal taste from an overall flavor profile is always tricky. But one thing I like to do is to see where you see similar comments on food coming up in different sources. So for example, one thing that seems to come up a lot that Byzantines really liked is they loved their food, especially their meat, to be drenched in fat.
Ah, sorry.
I know it sounds terrible. Yeah, yeah. We have an excerpt from a poem called the Temerion, in which an old philosopher is cooking a dish of salt pork and cabbage, and he mentions how it's just drenched in fat, and that's a very good thing. He can't wait to eat it. And we see this reference to food being drenched either in fat or oil repeatedly in a positive context in Byzantium. So we can get an idea that that's sort of something they liked. Another way that we can tell how people approach food is by looking at sort of turns of phrase or metaphorical statements within texts. So I'll give you an example of that. The 11th century history by Michael Adeliadis um, describes a abortive revolt against the emperor at the time, and he says that the people cared about the revolt about as much as they care about eating artichokes, which is to say, not very much, right?
Yeah.
um, so we can sort of get a sense of it from that. Another good example is from the 12th century history of Nicetas Coniates. He mentions that someone recoiled from something as they would recoil from the taste of raw octopus. Uh, so again, this is not sushi is not on the menu in Byzantium.
Yeah.
Uh, so we can look at little phraseology like that to get a sense of what the overall taste patterns are. One other thing we can actually look at is the account of, or sorry, the accounts of travelers to Constantinople and Byzantium to get a sense of well what they thought. And so, for example, we have the Italian bishop Luitprand of Cremona visited Constantinople twice in the mid 10th century as a emissary of the Pope to the emperor. And while he's there, he does historians a wonderful service by writing two fully detailed reports on his travels and contains a lot of information about how he felt about the food he was eating. So, for example, he attends an imperial banquet and remarks on the disgusting amount of garum and oil that all the food is just swimming in, and he can barely choke it down. It's absolutely repulsive, right? So clearly, to him, that that Byzantine idea of good flavor totally clashed with his Western medieval ideals of what food should be. So clearly, digging up these sort of flavor profiles of the past is difficult, but I think there's a few ways we can certainly approach the question.
Yes, and I really like the traveler's perspective. I'm wondering if Ibn Battuta went to Constantinople and did he eat something and did he talk about that? So I have one last question. It's a joke, mainly, to conclude. Um, do you sometimes eat like a Byzantine, maybe not emperor, but at least guy?
Well, it's funny because researching this has certainly influenced my diet. There's no question about it. One of the things I started eating that I never even ate before is lupins, like lupini seeds. Lupini are these sort of little pulses that are preserved in brine, and you eat them sort of like a snack food. And anyways, lupini were a very commonly sold snack food on the streets of Constantinople. And so one day I saw a big jar of these in the supermarket, and I thought I gotta try these. And now, hey, lupins are a wonderful snack, you know. So yeah, some of the diet certainly has sunk through.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adam. It was a lot of fun, and well, I'm not hungry, but I did enjoy the podcast a lot.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you.
That was Adam Morin, and you can find out more about his work in the show notes. Stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalists.net. Hi, Peter. How are you doing? What did you think of this episode?
Oh, I was really happy to find out what a Byzantine grocery list looks like.
Yeah.
I was really surprised, like, because I know how hard it must be to kind of for like food historians to find material, right? Like, especially the medieval period it's really
Mm.
hard. It's all so diverse. There's very few like cookbooks, or really stuff direct because no one kind of like, hey, I got to write about my what I'm eating today. Like that's it happens so rare. So like Adam was trying to, but he really did find, like, I was really surprised about stuff like the black cheese.
Yeah, there are always, these very crispy details.
Yeah, it's hard to, like, you always kind of see, like you hear about these things and you wonder how large were they for the present population, or is it everyone had like different types of interests in food, just like we do, and um, but it was interesting to see that, like, in Constantinople in particular, like, you have such a wide variety. And I was really, fascinated by the idea, like, that grocers are really, were called, like, pickled vegetable sellers, right?
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
so that this brings to me, like, the idea that, like, yeah, they have this kind of, all this kind of food that's kind of just waiting there to be picked up, right? In supplies, and it's just you have that kind of choices. So.
Yes. Yes, with the little shops, and you can just eat out,
Mhm.
have lunch
That's right.
anywhere in
Yeah,
Constantinople.
the idea, like this, Mediterranean type of diets, and
Yeah.
times, like, like this kind of like 2 meals a day. It was kind of interesting to really look at. So, I wish him well. He's going to have a tough time because he has to look through everything and kind of find bits and pieces. So, but
Yes, but it seems like to be pretty advanced in his
mm,
research and to already have a good grasp of everything. But as you said, it's so diverse. There are the rich, the poor, the monks, the laity. There are so many options, so many things to look at.
indeed, and again, as we kind of go back to the last episode where the scientific research and stuff like that,
Hmm.
like that stuff hasn't even really started. I think in like the Turkey and Greece areas. So when that kind of comes around, we'll probably have a lot more to learn.
Yes, because I had asked him about that, and he said that there's not a lot of data, and that is not, yeah, it's not there yet, as you just mentioned. So do you have any reading
Well,
recommendations?
I think if you like Byzantine stuff, you should check out like another podcast on the medievalist.net site. It's called Byzantium and Friends with Anthony Cadelis. So he's more of a senior scholar, and he talks to a lot of other kind of senior scholars, but like there's a lot of in-depth stuff, but also daily life. Like he's just been doing childhood and the giving birth in Byzantium, old age, things like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
So really kind of good stuff from him. So yeah, if you're into podcasts, Byzantium and Friends, check that out too.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks.
You were listening to the Medieval Grad Podcast, brought to you by medievalists.net. If you want to support us and this podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can also give us 5 stars and good review on Apple Podcasts. You can get a lot of neat benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear the episodes early. We love doing the show and we really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Laumonier. You can find me on Instagram at The French Medievalist, and you can look me up on academia.edu. Thank you very much for tuning in. Au revoir.